During World War II, General Dwight Eisenhower relied completely on his driver, Kay Summersby, and started a secret relationship with her. In 1945, he wrote a formal letter to his commanders asking to divorce his wife and marry her. The Army gave him a strict ultimatum: drop the divorce or lose the U.S. presidency. Eisenhower chose his political career and immediately cut all contact with her. He then ordered his staff to downgrade her role and deleted her from his official records. But 30 years later, a leaked document proved what he actually did. The narrative begins in May 1942. London is choking on the dust of the Blitz. The Luftwaffe has systematically reduced entire city blocks to rubble, and the air is thick with the smell of pulverized brick and cordite. Into this claustrophobic, paranoid environment steps Major General Dwight D. Eisenhower. He is newly arrived, carrying the immense psychological burden of an expeditionary force that is entirely unprepared for the sheer scale of the violence awaiting them. He is isolated, an outsider navigating a foreign capital where death falls from the sky without warning. His assigned driver is Kathleen Helen McCarthy Morrow, widely known as Kay Summersby, an Irish-born former fashion model. She is serving in the British Mechanized Transport Corps. She had spent the previous months driving ambulances through the bombed-out wreckage of London. She has seen the physical horrors of war up close. She is tasked with driving the American general through the shattered, pitch-black streets in a Packard staff car. The physical reality of their first weeks together dictates their bond. They are navigating blackout conditions, avoiding bomb craters, enclosed in the small cabin of a military vehicle. Summersby does not treat him with the fawning, terrified reverence of his military staff. She is direct, composed, and entirely unfazed by the stars on his shoulder. Her physical resilience acts as an immediate counterweight to his mounting anxiety. The dynamic shifts rapidly. The public perception of Eisenhower was that of a smiling, confident Midwesterner. The private reality was a man buckling under the strain of an unprecedented command. He finds that he simply cannot tolerate her absence. He maneuvers through strict military bureaucracy to have her officially appointed as his personal secretary and aide, pulling her out of the motor pool and placing her directly at the center of the Allied command structure. And here is the first fatal commitment, an action that will trap her later. To remain by his side as he moves across the volatile theaters of war, from the dust of North Africa to the liberated streets of France, Kay Summersby makes a drastic decision. She renounces her British citizenship. She naturalizes as an American and joins the United States Women's Army Corps. She willingly strips away her own national identity and legal protections for a man legally bound to someone else. And that very sacrifice will leave her completely defenseless when the political machine turns against her. Up to this point, everything is still a matter of wartime necessity. But as the casualty counts rise and the war intensifies, the general's psychological state begins to fracture. The Supreme Commander is about to entrust a former driver with the most dangerous secrets on Earth, crossing a line from which neither of them can ever return. The facade of the Supreme Commander was a meticulously engineered fiction. The world saw a man with a wide, reassuring grin, projecting the absolute certainty required to defeat the Axis powers. But Eisenhower's fatal weakness was a crushing, almost paralyzing fear of failure, masked entirely by that trademark Midwestern stoicism. As the commander of the Allied forces, he was actively making mathematical calculations that would send tens of thousands of young men into meat grinders. He had to navigate the towering, often irrational egos of Winston Churchill and Franklin D. Roosevelt, while managing the explosive volatility of field commanders like George S. Patton. In the presence of these men, and before the global press, Eisenhower could not exhibit a single micro-expression of doubt. If the commander showed fear, the entire political and military alliance would fracture. This absolute emotional lockdown required an outlet, and Kay Summersby became the designated vault for his terror. Behind the heavily guarded doors of his headquarters, the physical manifestations of his immense stress were unavoidable. He was burning through 4 packs of Camel cigarettes a day. His blood pressure spiked to dangerous levels, and chronic insomnia left him physically hollowed out. Summersby was the only person on Earth allowed to see the 5-star General pace the floorboards at 3 in the morning, his hands trembling as he reviewed the horrific casualty projections for upcoming offensives. She was no longer just an aide. She was his emotional bodyguard, tasked with keeping the Supreme Commander functionally sane. The true test of this psychological dependency arrived in late 1942 as the Allied command shifted focus to the invasion of North Africa. Eisenhower relocated his headquarters to Algiers, and Summersby was ordered to follow. During her voyage, the troopship she was aboard, the Strathallan, was struck by a German torpedo in the Mediterranean Sea. As the massive vessel burned and sank, Summersby was forced into an overcrowded lifeboat, surviving hours in freezing, oil-slicked waters while witnessing hundreds of troops drown around her. When she finally reached North Africa, traumatized and stripped of all her physical possessions, Eisenhower's reaction bypassed all standard military decorum. His desperate, visible relief at her survival solidified a reality that his high command was beginning to notice. Her presence was no longer a luxury, it was an operational requirement. The trust he placed in her soon crossed the line from emotional reliance into the highest echelons of national security. Eisenhower trusted Summersby to such an absolute degree that she was given direct, unhindered control over the most guarded secrets of the 20th century. She personally handled, sorted, and transcribed the ultra-secret planning documents for Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion of Normandy. She knew the drop zones, the troop movements, and the exact timing of the amphibious assaults. If she had been compromised or simply careless, the entire European theater would have collapsed in blood. They were bound together by an isolated reality that no one else could access. The environment they operated in was defined by a constant ambient proximity to death. In this pressure cooker, their connection transcended the boundaries of standard military hierarchy. It became a mechanism for mutual survival. She absorbed his anxiety so he could project invulnerability to the troops. She was the anchor keeping his psychological state from shattering. To endure the suffocating pressure of the impending invasion, they required a sanctuary where the war and his immense rank ceased to exist. They found it in Telegraph Cottage, a secluded 5-bedroom house safely beyond the blast radius of central London. Shielded from military protocols and the press, it became the physical embodiment of their staggering psychological contradiction. The disconnect between Eisenhower's public duty and his private refuge was absolute. In the morning, the Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force would sit in heavily guarded war rooms, making mathematical calculations regarding how many thousands of American boys would die on the beaches of France. He was deciding the fate of nations. But in the evening, behind the doors of Telegraph Cottage, he would take off his multi-starred jacket, tie on an apron, and stand in a small kitchen meticulously cooking vegetable soup from powdered military rations. Kay Summersby would set a modest table. They played house while the world burned outside their windows. They created a suburban fantasy that acted as a desperate firewall against the trauma of their reality. They even acquired a physical symbol of this artificial domesticity, a black Scottish terrier puppy. They named him Telek, a clever secret portmanteau combining Telegraph Eisenhower and Kay. This animal was not merely a pet. He became a surrogate child for a couple that could never legally exist in the light of day. 80s noted the rare, unguarded affection Eisenhower displayed as he rolled on the floor with the dog, temporarily shedding the armor of a conqueror. The romance they forged was not one of glamorous hotel suites or relaxed vacations. It was snatched entirely in the violent margins of a global slaughter. Summersby later wrote of their stolen kisses taking place in the freezing, unpressurized cabins of B-17 flying fortresses. As they flew at 10,000 feet over the Atlantic or across North Africa, vibrating from the deafening roar of 4 massive radial engines, they would grip each other's hands in the dark fuselage. They shared desperate, hurried moments of intimacy disguised by the chaos of military transport. It was a relationship built on the razor's edge of survival. For decades, the American public and historians searched for evidence of a standard, illicit physical affair. But the truth, revealed by Kay Summersby in the final months of her life, was far more complex. When Summersby wrote her 1976 memoir Past Forgetting, she explicitly addressed the physical nature of their relationship. The affair was deeply, passionately romantic, but structurally, it was never consummated in the traditional physical sense. The reason was not a sudden burst of moral restraint. The reason was sheer biological collapse. By the spring of 1944, the weight of the impending D-Day invasion had physically crushed Eisenhower. He was surviving on black coffee, extreme nicotine intake, and pure adrenaline. The terrifying responsibility of sending 150,000 men across the English Channel into the teeth of the German Atlantic Wall had triggered a profound physiological response. The chronic exhaustion and immense psychological trauma left the Supreme Commander suffering from temporary, stress-induced impotence. If this relationship had merely been about opportunistic physical release, it would have ended there. But this medical reality did not diminish their affair. It amplifies it to a terrifying degree. It proves that their connection was not a superficial dalliance, but an absolute intertwining of souls. When his body failed under the weight of the war, their emotional dependency only deepened. They spent nights simply holding each other in the dark, exchanging warmth in a terrifyingly cold world. Summersby rubbed his temples, listened to his night terrors, and absorbed the agonizing guilt he felt for every soldier who would be slaughtered on Omaha Beach. She was his confessor and his shield, and this complete emotional enmeshment is exactly what makes his eventual betrayal so grotesque. He didn't just walk away from a casual mistress. He would eventually amputate the very person who had carried his soul through the darkest days of the 20th century. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic Ocean, the illusion of their isolated world was beginning to crack. In a quiet apartment in Washington, D.C., Mamie Eisenhower was reading the daily newspapers. She was far from naive. The American press, though largely compliant with strict military censorship regarding troop movements, frequently published photographs of the conquering hero. And lurking in the background of almost every single photograph, impeccably dressed in her tailored uniform, was the striking, ever-present Irish driver. The military wives' rumor mill, a highly efficient intelligence network of its own, was ruthlessly feeding the fire. Mamie's letters across the ocean shifted from supportive missives to frantic, agonizing documents laced with bitter jealousy and pointed accusations. Eisenhower found himself trapped in a brutal geographic and moral vice. He was receiving guilt-inducing letters from a wife he had married in 1916, a woman demanding loyalty and explanations from thousands of miles away. Yet, the woman he actually relied upon to survive the daily horror of his command was sitting right across the desk from him. Kay Summersby suffered the unique, silent agony of the secret partner. She had to sit quietly, organizing his schedule or pouring his coffee, watching the man she loved write reassuring, deceptive letters back to a wife in America. She had to swallow her pride and accept her shadow status, bound by the draconian rules of the 1940s military and the rigid social hierarchy of the era. She believed, foolishly, that her silent sacrifice and her absolute loyalty would eventually be rewarded when the guns fell silent. But the plot twist waiting for them in the summer of 1945 was not a happy reunion. The end of the war would not bring them together. It would trigger a ruthless collision between a private promise of love and the terrifying machinery of ultimate political power. The guns of Europe fell silent in May 1945. Nazi Germany officially surrendered in a shattered schoolhouse in Reims, France. But for Dwight D. Eisenhower, the end of the global slaughter merely signaled the beginning of a devastating personal reckoning. The artificial, suspended reality he and Kay Summersby had inhabited for 3 years evaporated overnight. The adrenaline that had fueled their survival suddenly drained away, leaving behind the cold, hard mathematics of their future. The war was over. It was time to pay the toll. And this is the exact moment that forever alters our understanding of the man. Eisenhower did not intend to walk away. In the euphoric, disorienting aftermath of the victory, his profound attachment to Kay overpowered his legendary caution. He made a decision that revealed the true, staggering depth of his devotion. Sitting at his desk in his heavily guarded headquarters, the Supreme Commander took out his personal stationery and drafted a letter that was tantamount to political suicide. He wrote directly to his supreme mentor, the Chief of Staff of the United States Army, General George C. Marshall. Eisenhower explicitly and formally stated his intention to return to the United States, initiate divorce proceedings against Mamie Eisenhower, and marry Kay Summersby. The political landscape of 1945 amplified the explosive magnitude of this decision. Eisenhower was no longer just a general, he was a living demigod. Both the Republican and Democratic parties were already circling him, recognizing that the man who defeated Hitler was guaranteed the White House. He was the smiling, irreproachable face of American moral supremacy. But in the social climate of the 1940s, a divorced politician was damaged goods. A 5-star general who divorced his wife of 30 years to marry his foreign military driver was a radioactive scandal that would destroy his reputation overnight. General George C. Marshall did not read Eisenhower's letter as a plea from a desperate friend. He read it as a catastrophic threat to a vital national asset. Marshall was the cold, calculating architect of the American military machine, a man who viewed human beings as deployable resources, and his response was a masterpiece of institutional brutality. While the original letters were later destroyed to protect the presidency, the contents of Marshall's ultimatum have been corroborated by multiple historical accounts, most notably by President Harry Truman, who was later briefed on the explosive exchange. Marshall's reply was immediate, unyielding, and terrifyingly precise. He informed Eisenhower that if he even attempted to proceed with this divorce, Marshall would personally see to his utter destruction. He threatened to strip Eisenhower of his command. He promised to drum him out of the military in absolute permanent disgrace. He would ensure that every ounce of his wartime heroism was buried under a manufactured, sensationalized moral scandal, leaving him a pariah in the country he had just helped save. Marshall made it violently clear, if Eisenhower chose love, he would be left with nothing else. This moment laid bare the true, calculating nature of ultimate power. Marshall was not acting as a moral guardian outraged by marital infidelity. The military establishment had quietly ignored the discreet, back-channel affairs of generals for decades. Marshall was acting as a brand manager. He was protecting the flawless, highly marketable image of the American savior. Eisenhower was simply too valuable a property to be allowed the luxury of personal happiness. When Eisenhower received Marshall's response, the physical manifestation of his fatal weakness, his desperate need for validation, and his deep-seated terror of public failure took total control. Staring at the paper, his chronic hypertension flaring, Eisenhower was forced to look down the barrel of his own ruin. On one side of the ledger was the woman who had absorbed his night terrors, the woman who had anchored his sanity through the darkest chapter of human history. On the other side was his legacy, his 5 stars, the adulation of millions, and a direct, unhindered path to the most powerful office in the world. Faced with the threat of becoming a disgraced, forgotten footnote, the Supreme Commander folded. The ruthless, calculating instincts of the ambitious politician overrode the heart of the desperate man. He chose the crown. He chose his legacy. He decided to sacrifice Kay Summersby on the altar of his ambition. And this is where things really get dirty. I call this outcome grotesque, not merely because a wartime romance ended, but because of the surgical, mechanized cruelty with which Eisenhower executed the separation. Once he submitted to Marshall's threat, the machinery of the state moved in to sanitize the narrative, and Eisenhower simply shut the door. There was no agonizing, tearful farewell. There was no gentle letdown or profound explanation offered to the woman who had traded her country and her reputation for his survival. He simply followed orders, packed his bags, and flew back to the United States. He stepped off the plane in Washington, D.C., the conquering hero, and immediately took his place beside Mamie Eisenhower. The flashbulbs popped, the crowds roared, and the impenetrable facade of the loyal American husband was instantly, seamlessly restored for the newsreels. Back in Europe, Kay Summersby was met with a deafening, terrifying silence. When she desperately attempted to call his office, her calls were intercepted, logged, and blocked by his staff. The letters she wrote, pouring out her confusion and heartbreak, were returned entirely unread. Eisenhower's political handlers initiated a quiet, ruthlessly efficient campaign to erase her existence from his official history. To pave a spotless road to the 1952 presidential election, they had to ensure she was a ghost. The woman who had managed the most sensitive documents of Operation Overlord, the woman who had sat beside him in the highest-level strategic meetings, was systematically downgraded in the official military records. They retroactively reduced her to a mere driver, a background extra in the grand sweeping theater of his life. Kay Summersby had given up everything. Her previous fiancé, an American officer named Richard Arnold, had been killed in action in North Africa while she was serving Eisenhower. She had surrendered her British citizenship, alienated her family, and spent 4 years absorbing the toxic, crushing psychological poison of the Supreme Commander. Now, the war was over. The man she loved was parading down the avenues of America, and she was left stranded in a military that no longer needed her, entirely alone, a discarded asset of a victorious empire. The aftermath of this erasure was a slow, agonizing attrition of Kay Summersby's spirit. She attempted to rebuild a normal life in the ashes of her wartime existence. In 1952, the very year Dwight D. Eisenhower was elected the 34th President of the United States, Kay married a Wall Street stockbroker named Reginald H. Morgan. But the marriage was doomed from its inception. It quickly collapsed into divorce. The ghost of the Supreme Commander was simply too massive. No ordinary man could replace the terrifying, historic intensity of the bond she had forged under the constant threat of annihilation. For nearly 30 years, she kept her silence. She watched from a distance as Eisenhower served 2 terms in the White House, revered worldwide as the grandfatherly architect of American prosperity. She allowed the political machine to win, retreating into the shadows just as she had been ordered to do. But the final plot twist arrived in 1975, when the political establishment could no longer touch her. Kay Summersby was diagnosed with terminal cancer. Facing the absolute certainty of her own death, the fear of military retribution and social ostracization finally evaporated. She realized that if she died quietly, the sanitized, sterilized version of history drafted by Eisenhower's handlers would become permanent. With her final agonizing months of life, she decided to tear down the facade. She dictated her second and final memoir, Past Forgetting, My Love Affair with Dwight D. Eisenhower. It was a direct, unfiltered confession to the world. She did not write it out of vindictive spite or a desire for cheap vengeance. She wrote it to reclaim her own existence, to prove that her life, her love, and her profound sacrifice were real. She died in early 1975, before the book could be released. When the memoir was published posthumously in 1976, it hit the American public like a shockwave. It completely shattered the carefully curated, wholesome mythos of the Eisenhower era. It forced a reluctant nation to look behind the 5-star rank and see the deeply flawed, terrified, and fundamentally human man who had desperately clung to a woman in the dark to survive the weight of his own command, Dwight D. Eisenhower was not a monster. He is the ultimate tragic product of a ruthless institutional machine that demanded flawless execution and actively punished human vulnerability. His political and military legacy is undeniable, but his personal legacy is a profound moral debt. The history books credit Eisenhower with maintaining the psychological fortitude required to defeat fascism, hold the Allies together, and save the free world. But if it weren't for Kay Summersby, if it weren't for a driver who absorbed his terror, anchored his sanity, and sacrificed her own future in the quiet isolation of Telegraph Cottage, history might have recorded the catastrophic psychological collapse of the Supreme Commander. He rewarded her absolute devotion with 30 years of calculated institutional silence. And history rewarded him with the world. The story of their severance does not actually end with her immediate silence. For decades, the political establishment believed they had successfully buried Kay Summersby. But history has a terrifying habit of unearthing its own ghosts, and the catalyst for this resurrection did not come from Kay herself, but from the highest level of the American government. In 1973, an author named Merle Miller published an oral biography of former President Harry S. Truman, titled Plain Speaking. Truman, a man who harbored a deep, simmering disdain for Eisenhower's later political opportunism, casually dropped a historical bombshell. During his taped interviews, Truman revealed the existence of the George C. Marshall correspondence. Truman explicitly stated that Eisenhower had written to Marshall asking to marry his driver, and that Marshall had threatened to destroy him. Truman claimed he had personally ordered the letters pulled from the Pentagon archives and destroyed to protect the office of the presidency. When this revelation hit the press, it cracked the impenetrable marble of the Eisenhower mythos, and in a quiet apartment in New York, a rapidly aging Kay Summersby read the headlines. For nearly 30 years, she had adhered strictly to the unwritten code of military loyalty. She had protected the man who had abandoned her, enduring 2 failed marriages and a life of quiet obscurity. But Truman's leak fundamentally changed the calculus. The secret was out, but it was being told by politicians. It was being framed as a clinical, strategic crisis of command. The human element, her total sacrifice, was entirely absent. Then, the final inescapable deadline arrived. Kay Summersby was diagnosed with terminal liver cancer. The physical manifestation of her final battle was a stark, cruel contrast to the glamorous, uniformed driver of 1942. She was confined to a hospital bed, her body ravaged by aggressive chemotherapy, her energy depleted to mere minutes of lucidity a day. Yet, faced with the absolute certainty of her own death, the fear of military retribution vanished. If she died now, she would be remembered only as a scandalous, nameless footnote in Harry Truman's political gossip. She realized she had to take back control of her own narrative. She enlisted the help of a journalist, Barbara Wyden, to assemble her memories. The process was physically agonizing. Surrounded by IV drips and the sterile smell of the oncology ward, Kay pulled out the few artifacts she had managed to save from the Pentagon's purge. She had a handful of sanitized, platonic letters Eisenhower was permitted to send her after the war. She had her private wartime diaries, and she had faded photographs of Telegraph Cottage and their dog, Telek. She dictated her story not with the furious, bitter vengeance of a jilted lover, but with the clinical precision of a soldier setting the record straight. She detailed the unconsummated nature of their physical bond to deliberately dismantle the cheap, sensationalized rumors. She wanted the public to understand the crushing, suffocating psychological weight of the Supreme Command. She wanted them to see the terrifying vulnerability of the man they worshipped. When past forgetting, My Love Affair with Dwight D. Eisenhower was finally published in 1976, Kay was already dead. She did not live to see the fallout. The reaction from the American public and the surviving political establishment was visceral and immediate. Major historians, deeply invested in the great man theory of Eisenhower, immediately launched a coordinated counteroffensive. Biographers like Stephen Ambrose initially dismissed her memoir as the exaggerated fantasies of an ailing woman. The Eisenhower family maintained a rigid, icy silence, refusing to publicly acknowledge the book's existence. Mamie Eisenhower, living out her final years as a revered widow in Gettysburg, was forced to endure the absolute humiliation of seeing her husband's deepest emotional betrayal serialized in national magazines. But the military-industrial complex that had worked so diligently to protect Eisenhower's flawless image was completely powerless against the testimony of a dead woman. Over the following decades, as more archival evidence trickled out and Truman's accounts were verified, the historical consensus shifted. The biographers who had attacked her were quietly forced to revise their texts. Kay's account was verified by the sheer, undeniable psychological reality of the war. The historical record reveals a man fractured in two. He projected unwavering confidence publicly, while privately relying on a subordinate to manage his debilitating anxiety. Simultaneously, it exposes a military establishment acting as brand managers, willing to weaponize a general's career and erase a loyal aide to protect a valuable political asset. Eisenhower secured his 5 stars. He secured the White House. He secured his place in the pantheon of American titans. But he paid for it by fundamentally betraying his own humanity. He discarded the only person who offered him a sanctuary when the rest of the world demanded a savior. This is the ultimate paradox of their story. Dwight D. Eisenhower possessed the power to command millions of men, to conquer continents, and to shape the geopolitical landscape of the modern world. He had the entire apparatus of the United States government working to sanitize his legacy, but he could not outrun the memory of the woman he left behind. In the end, Kay Summersby executed the most devastating flanking maneuver in modern political history. She allowed him to have his crown, his presidency, and his unblemished victory. She waited until the political machine could no longer silence her, and then she dismantled his personal mythology with absolute surgical truth. The legacy of Dwight D. Eisenhower will forever be etched in the marble of Washington, D.C., but the legacy of Kay Summersby serves as a permanent, undeniable moral debt. Her story forces us to look past the military medals and confront the grotesque human cost of ultimate power. History is often written by the victors, but as Kay Summersby proved, the truth is kept alive by those who refuse to be forgotten. To truly comprehend the grotesque nature of this historical severance, we must track the story beyond the publication of the memoir and examine the physical and psychological monuments these two figures left behind. The aftermath of their separation is not just a footnote in a biography. It is the ultimate indictment of how absolute power insulates itself from human consequence. Consider the physical reality of Dwight D. Eisenhower's final chapter. He spent his twilight years retreating to a sprawling, pristine farm in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, a property purchased and maintained through the immense financial security of his rank and political status. He died in 1969, universally mourned by the global establishment. Today, his remains lie beneath the soaring, monumental architecture of the Eisenhower Presidential Library in Abilene, Kansas. He is surrounded by polished marble floors, bronze statues, and endless rows of sanitized glass display cases that meticulously document every military triumph and political victory. He is entombed in the very mythology that General George C. Marshall violently protected. The American system built a fortress of stone to ensure that the Supreme Commander would never be remembered as anything less than a demigod. Now, contrast that with the final physical trace of Kay Summersby. She did not receive a state funeral. There were no 21-gun salutes, no international dignitaries bowing their heads, and no sprawling architectural monuments built in her honor. After she died in 1975, her physical remains were quietly cremated. Following her last wishes, her ashes were taken back across the Atlantic Ocean, returning to the shores of her homeland. They were scattered into the cold, turbulent winds of County Cork, Ireland. She dissolved back into the earth, leaving behind no statues, no libraries, and no marble tombs. The military-industrial complex had successfully ensured that she would possess no physical footprint in the nation she had sacrificed her citizenship to serve. But this staggering disparity in physical monuments highlights the most profound, drama-filled contradiction of Eisenhower's entire existence. In his famous 1961 farewell address to the nation, President Eisenhower delivered a chilling, prophetic warning to the American people. He stared into the television cameras and explicitly warned the public to guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence by the military-industrial complex. He warned that the sheer weight of this massive, automated machine could endanger our liberties and our democratic processes. It is a stunning piece of historical irony. The man who stood at the podium, warning the world about the terrifying, dehumanizing machinery of the state was the very man who had willingly allowed that exact machine to surgically amputate the most profound human connection of his life. He knew exactly how ruthless the system was, because he was both its supreme architect and its most tragic, silent victim. He had allowed the machine to dictate his heart. He is not a devil. To label Eisenhower a villain is to fundamentally misunderstand the crushing, incomprehensible physics of global leadership during the 20th century. He was the product of an era and an institution that viewed human frailty as a fatal tactical vulnerability. The United States military in 1945 did not require a man. It required an icon. Eisenhower understood the brutal calculus of his environment. He knew that the free world needed a flawless, smiling hero to lead them into the terrifying dawn of the atomic age and the Cold War. He recognized that to fulfill his duty to the nation, the private, terrified man who paced the floors of Telegraph Cottage had to be completely eradicated. He did not discard Kay Summersby because he was evil. He discarded her because the crown he was destined to wear allowed no room for personal truth. However, understanding the mechanics of his decision does not absolve him of its brutality. His legacy is an eternal, unpayable moral debt. We celebrate Eisenhower for the interstate highway system, for holding the line against Soviet expansion, and for maintaining the psychological fortitude required to execute the destruction of the Third Reich. We study his brilliant logistical mind and his unparalleled ability to manage the egos of global dictators and allied prime ministers. But history must issue a conditional verdict on the soul of the Supreme Commander. If it weren't for the quiet, unyielding strength of a former Irish fashion model, a woman who absorbed his crippling anxiety, anchored his sanity in the darkest hours of human history, and provided a desperately needed illusion of peace amid global slaughter, history might have recorded a very different outcome. If it weren't for Kay Summersby, the man we know as the savior of Europe might have shattered under the weight of his own command before the troops ever hit the beaches of Normandy. She was the invisible shield that protected the mind of the conqueror. He took that shield, survived the fire, and then deliberately left it to rust in the dark. That is the true price of the American presidency. That is the grotesque, terrifying reality of ultimate power. It does not merely corrupt, it sterilizes. It demands that you strip away your own humanity, betray the people who kept you alive, and stand alone in the marble halls of history, a flawless, empty monument to a victory you could never have achieved by yourself. This brings us to the end of our investigation. The story of Dwight D. Eisenhower and Kay Summersby challenges us to look beyond the polished bronze and marble of our historical monuments. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about the architects of our modern world. Now, I turn the final verdict over to you. Do you believe General George C. Marshall was justified in threatening Eisenhower's career to protect the stability of the American presidency? Or was it a purely self-serving act of institutional cruelty? How much of our own humanity are we willing to let our leaders sacrifice for the sake of global security? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and this is a debate that history has entirely failed to settle. If you appreciate this kind of unvarnished investigative history, where we strip away the sanitized myths, ignore the textbooks, and confront the actual, often grotesque human cost of power, please leave a like on this video, subscribe to the channel, and make sure the notification bell is turned on so you never miss a case. We don't do superficial summaries here. We look for the truth hidden in the margins. Thank you for giving me your time. Until next time, keep questioning the narrative and never assume the official record is the whole story.